is Dr. Emily Sharding with AR. I'd like to say hello to all of our friends in Virginia. Now, this is a state where we already have serious challenges related to high tide flooding. Let's check that out. If we look at the federal report, we can see over here the change in the range of daily mean higher high water mark in Norfolk, Virginia from the 60s to 2010. And we can see that the average has moved a lot closer to the point where flooding begins. Unfortunately, there's no reasonable person who doesn't think that that average is going to move substantially farther over to the point where the mean is on top of the flooding begins point in the next 20 to 30 years. So we're talking about an area in Virginia that is very vulnerable to sea level rise, that is already experiencing the effects. High tide flooding today around the Virginia Beach area poses daily risks to businesses, neighborhoods, infrastructure, and transportation. Let's look more detail at how the flooding and sea level rise are connected. We're going to check out the NOAA sea level rise viewer. So this tool is interesting for Virginia because, Virginia, of course, has these big impacts from DC. And we're often able to get a different read on what Washington is saying by looking at Virginia. That's why 10 feet is the highest model for the higher high water mark in sea level rise. It's because 10 feet is their out there range for what they think this coast could see by 2100. You should know it's very unlikely that's going to happen. 10 feet is what we would be looking at if we didn't reduce emissions at all, and if we were wrong about our more conservative models for glacial melt. A more realistic scenario is that we're going to follow the 4.5 pathway for emissions, which is kind of a market-driven, very moderate emissions pathway. There's ways that it sucks. I mean, it's not going to save the coral reefs, and it's going to have terrible impacts in the rest of the world, but it provides a tolerable future for the US, and it does appear that the RCP 4.5 pathway is the one that most US legislation is actually pushing for. And that would put us at 3 to 3.5 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century, 2 to 3 feet by mid-century, which is what we're going to look at in this forecast. So even from the overhead view, we can see that 2-3 feet is going to change Virginia's beaches enormously. Let's look down in this particularly vulnerable area here by Norfolk first. So this is our current mean higher high water mark. You can see that even another foot turns a lot of your vulnerable estuary type areas from a mix of sea and land into sea, and that continues to 2 feet and 3 feet. It's interesting if you zoom way in, check it out, even at 3 feet, the direct impact to housing stock is pretty limited. It's not like in some of our Gulf Coast videos where we've seen enormous neighborhoods will be underwater by 2050. No, if you wanted to ignore flooding risks, you'd think that this part of Virginia might be pretty okay. But it gives you a real insight when you look at the natural areas over here where you have some nice wildlife conservation areas, and you look at 3 feet of sea level rise, you see the enormous level of land loss. And you have to imagine that, say, this agricultural area is going to experience changes as well, even though we don't see it on the sea level rise map. That there's probably going to be some saltwater incursion, that area is going to become increasingly marshy, that area will flood anytime that there's a hurricane or a big rainstorm. And so even though you don't see so much direct impact, when we come back, we can see, even though you don't see the big direct impact, the impact is coming because the vulnerability to the flooding is going to be so enormous. But let's look at some other places in the state. If we look inland to Richmond here, I think that this is an area with a bright future, and we'll point it out on some other maps as we look at temperature change maps in the future. We can see that a lot of the housing stock is far enough away to be completely unimpacted by the limited changes that they are seeing. Here's the current mean higher high water mark. Here's 3 feet, limited inundation, some beach loss. This is an area that's very protected from flooding, that the infrastructure is going to be able to make the adaptation changes much more easily than we see in communities closer to Virginia Beach. We go back to the current mean higher high water mark, and let's go up and take a look at DC. We've got the overhead view here. Let's zoom in one more tick and just take a bird's eye view of what's going to happen. We do see this is an area with some deeper channeling where, like down in Portsmouth, you're going to be more concerned about flooding than direct impacts. You can see that at 3 feet of sea level rise, you're already beginning to have problems with the golf course. And if you don't reduce emissions, this is going to impact people in Washington, you'll have nowhere to golf. It's sad. People do make changes, though, mostly based on their personal experiences. The fact that we're looking at such dramatically different 2100 outcomes in areas that are personally impactful to the political class. I mean, look at this. If we don't reduce emissions, you're going to have flooding on the National Mall all the time. All the basements of the Smithsonian are going to be flooded. It's going to be a big problem. And of course, nowhere to golf. But if you look at a moderate reduction in emissions, you're going to have far fewer problems downtown, and you're going to preserve many of our cultural areas that would otherwise be lost. It's worth considering. And I think that this sort of personal experience will drive decision making towards reduced emissions. When it's going to impact the people in power directly, that's when you see behavior change. So as we would expect, with all that coastal transformation, with that terrible rate of beach loss that you're looking at, and transitions right up against the housing stock, we would expect these communities in Virginia to be making plans. Norfolk, Virginia, with that vulnerable naval base, has one of the most publicized action maps. If we look into the national report, we can see that by the end of the century, they hope to have designed a completely new roadmap for their city. These orange areas are what they call adaptation areas, where sea level rise is going to make these areas pretty uninhabitable. So they're going to try and pull people out of them and get them into the purple neighborhoods of the future and the green new urban centers. The question, of course, arises, what does that mean if I live in the orange area, right? Is anyone going to pay for me to move? Is anyone going to pay me for my house? This is an unclear part of this exciting new future plan. And it's a reason why regular people like you and me should know about this now so that we can take care of ourselves. I don't think that you can trust people to take care of you, even in communities that are designing plans like this. It's all serious. If we're seeing community transformation, people are still going to need to move or want to move if they don't want to be part of the transformation. And this, again, is just considering the housing impacts of sea level rise. The changes to the coastline that we're seeing, they also have potential for major impacts on inland freshwater systems. That could cause saltwater to run into the freshwater in new ways, for current freshwater systems to become estuarial systems. That's going to impact drinking water, right? And agriculture, primarily in negative ways, as you might imagine. But it's worth considering the potential for habitat creation when we're talking about these new estuaries. When we look at that big picture, particularly around the Virginia Beach area, you saw there are these incredibly naturally rich areas in today's estuaries, important for birds, for shellfish, for so many living things. They depend on that habitat where land and sea meet. Helping new estuaries grow where land and sea will meet tomorrow, I think it's an interesting opportunity. It's not the sort of career that exists today, but those estuaries, they're natural areas with high habitat value, high food value, high ecotourism value. I'm not saying in any way that this level of land shift is a positive, but every change brings opportunities. And I do think this opportunity, what we might call assisted estuary migration, is one that not a lot of people have on their radars. On the coast, of course, we want to consider the potential for hurricane impacts. Let's look at some of the modeling for future hurricane patterns. In the federal report, we're going to look at the changes to the GFDL hurricane model and the GFDN hurricane model. We can see that they currently predict 14, 17 storms forming, named storms. By the end of the century, we're going to expect 19 to 24, so a notable increase. And you can see that more of them are coming inland. If you live on the Gulf Coast of Florida, this is going to be a pretty terrifying map. And if you live in Virginia, you should see that more storms in both models are predicted to pass over the coast inland after they hit, meaning that even though you might not be dealing with a lot more direct impacts, which of course have that terrible wind as well as water damage, you should prepare for more drenching rains. And there has already been a trend of terrible flooding, drenching rains over the last 10 years in the Carolinas and in Virginia. We should be prepared for that to get worse and think about the impact on infrastructure and how we can adapt to it. But let's pull in for a second. I mean, we talked about the coast a lot, and we're definitely talking about big changes and impacts to the coastal areas just in terms of geography. But we need to build up a richer picture of what Virginia as a whole state is going to be like. We know a heat up is coming. It's already getting hotter. I mean, Virginia has started the response. The DOT has dedicated crews now that repair the roads during extreme heat events. And like, we need to show some respect to those people. Can you imagine? It's already an extreme heat event and you're out there working with hot asphalt to take care of the rest of us. It's a real heroic effort right there. This is a state, this is working people who are adapting the infrastructure along with the changes. Let's see how hot we might expect it to get though by 2050. We're going to look at a tool for the USDA to do that. So this is the heat zone viewer. It's based on historical data from 1980 to 2009. And the colors tell us how many days over 86 we expect to see in the area. So like we'd expect for Virginia, you got a lot of differences throughout the state. This reddish color here, this peach color indicates up to 4 months over 86. The rest of this plain as we get towards the coast, we're looking at more like 3 months up to 86 in contemporary. And of course, we see this nice cooler area as we're looking through the mountains here. Let's look at how it's going to look by 2050. And this is under the reduced emission scenario, the RCP 4.5 scenario. We still see a big change, but let me tell you, compared to other states, this is much more even heat up, and very few people are going to be seeing more than 2 months of increase in heat, which is kind of the margin where you start to experience a lot of big challenges for plant communities. We can see the places that used to have 4 months of a warm summer are going to have 5, that much of the state, including DC and this vulnerable area here by Virginia Beach, is going to be looking at up to 120 days over 86 a year, and that the mountains, they're not able to hold their cool as well as we might like. I think it's important to point out that it's a little hard to see on my screen, but there's a distinction between the yellow and this sort of minty color here. Here you're looking at maybe 60 days over 86, where here you're looking at 90. So that's a big difference. And we do see some areas, especially over here, where there is relatively conserved cooling, even though we are talking about a substantial heat up for the mountains. This area is one of my preferred zones to watch in the mountains for relative conservation. Before we move on and talk about anything else, there is another component of heating that's very important in the Southeast, and that is nighttime heating. I'm going to show you in the federal report. Historically, much of the Southeast, including Virginia, which is the region where you're grouped, had very few nights over 75 degrees. And this is projected to change substantially, even more than daytime temperature, by the mid-century. If you look here, this is your mid-century figure for RCP 4.5, and we can see here that many of your populated areas, most vulnerably that sort of Norfolk, Portsmouth area, are going to see substantially more warm nights by mid-century. We notice almost no change in the mountain area, so they're losing the daytime cool, but they're keeping the nighttime cool, which is important for your agricultural prospects in the mountains. And up by DC, we also see some increase in nighttime warming. When you see that combination of daytime and nighttime warming, that should be a real alarm bell for you related to infrastructure, because you're going to have round-the-clock power demands in the summer. Particularly in urban areas, that makes you think you need a tune-up for the power infrastructure. And as an individual, you might want to think about how you can develop some power independence so that you can keep the air on in a heat emergency. Looking away from the heat, let's check out plant hardiness zones. They're a good proxy for winter lows. And we're going to be using another USDA tool for that. This is the USDA plant hardiness zone map. Again, looking at historical data from the 80s to 2009. And we see a variety of contemporary plant hardiness zones, from zone 8 over here by Virginia Beach to zone 7 across most of this area. Lots of great agricultural opportunities. and zone 6 up in the mountains. Looking at how that's going to change under RCP 4.5 by 2050, we see a huge expansion of that zone 8 area. Before, Virginia Beach had sort of a distinctive beach ecosystem. Now we see the potential for that ecosystem to take over all of Chesapeake Bay. It's substantial. The daytime and summer temperatures are also going to be changing in concert, so you could see big ecosystem migration. We see a conservation of zone 7 in parts of the state here. Richmond is sort of in a pocket where it will be between zone 6 and zone 7, a relatively mild change, relatively stronger conservation. Where you see that up around DC, it is going to be changing a pretty full zone shift. Let's go back and forth just so that we can check that out again. Yep, we can see that that was in a clear zone 6 today, and it will be in a clear zone 7 by 2050. In the mountains here, this area right in here that is zone 7 today and is staying zone 7, that area right in there, there's nice relative conservation of every measure we've looked at so far. I think it's worth noting. And I think it's worth noting that there is one tiny pocket of zone 6 remaining. So if you want to stay in the coldest part of the mountains in Virginia, this is the area where you're going to want to look, is kind of broadly around that point. So thinking back about the coast, and I know I'm talking about the coast a lot, but the changes that they're dealing with are so overwhelming compared with the changes in the mountains. I want to mention sea turtles. I know that that's maybe not as important to some of you, but I have like a thing for sea turtles. We expect to see more of them coming into the coastal areas, coming farther up into Chesapeake Bay than they ever have before, trying to nest as we move towards 2050. Their reproduction, you might not know, is intensely impacted by temperature. Their eggs become male or female depending on temperature. It's very unusual, very different from human reproduction. If it gets too warm in their nesting sites, all the babies are female. They can't generate males except if they get below a certain coolness threshold. So any turtle that gets high enough up north to lay eggs where the babies turn male, those males are going to have a disproportionate genetic impact on the population. So as we talk about beaches that are historically north of Turtle Range, I figure you might want to know why those new nests are particularly important to the survival of sea turtles. As we think about beach conservation, we should be thinking about them. Let's add one more piece of information to this forecast and look at the flooding rains, which have already been a big problem in parts of the state, really quite serious over in West Virginia. We're going back to the federal report again to look at the changes in precipitation. You know, we are not good at looking at what exactly the weather is going to be like 3 weeks out. So you might imagine it's not precise what we're going to see 3 decades out. But we can look at trends, and clear trends have emerged in the precipitation across the Southeast. We expect to see more of the same. You can tell from the dots here where a blue means a decrease in heavy precipitation and a red means an increase, that like with other parts of the Virginia forecast, we have intense regional variability. In that conservation pocket, we see very pale dots indicating a limited trend. Nice, means limited change in your precipitation. In this area here, right by Norfolk and Portsmouth, away from the sea, away from Virginia Beach, we see very strong trends towards heavy flooding rains, further complicating their struggles with flooding. As we get up towards Richmond, we see some paler dots emerge, indicating maybe some more positives in the outlook for that area. And up by the DC suburbs, we see some dark red circles indicating the presence of even more flooding rains. We saw that sea level rise is going to impact them, and from a flooding perspective, the rains are also going to cause increased flooding. So challenges for some of your current urban areas in the state. And if we pull it together, I mean, Virginia has a challenging outlook as a state, but if you break it down and look at the challenges place by place, the variation is very intense. I showed you that conservation sweet spot where if you're like me and you like a little room to breathe, that place looks pretty good. I'm not saying it's easy to live there now. I'm saying that it's going to change less there, probably much less than in other parts of the state. Looking up at the DC suburbs, we're looking at a likely serious increase in extreme rains, as well as substantial daytime and some nighttime warning, meaning that an infrastructure upgrade is going to be essential. Fortunately for everyone, that area appears to be on it. Down by Virginia Beach, we have communities that are struggling to adapt already, like Norfolk and Portsmouth, that are already seeing the impacts of sea level rise on their homes. They're making plans to restructure the cities. They're going to need to. They're not necessarily talking about moving towards an awful climate. I mean, South Carolina is different, but it's a pleasant climate in many ways. Between the changes to the climate, though, the changes to the coastline, the question about if these transformations are going to offer buyouts to individuals, that part of the state is going to feel very different by 2050 than it does today. In that area, we do see a big future market for flood construction services and probably interesting opportunities related to estuary development. Your big winner in terms of urban stability is going to be Richmond by mid-century. They have not such an intense projected change in precipitation, not such a severe flooding outlook. The challenge is going to be reduced to adapting to the heat, which you got to pick your challenges. That's not so many. If I was going to call opportunities, I think that Richmond is going to be very attractive to people who are relocating from the Virginia Beach area. It's not so far away. Climate's fairly stable, some more winter stability than other parts of the state. It's nice there too. Richmond, you're a cool town. So depending on where you are in Virginia, your challenges for preparation are going to be different. But no matter where you are, this is a great time to get ready. This is Dr. Sharing with AR signing out. Please like and subscribe and help get the message out there, because there is hope. What we're looking at, it's not something for which you can't prepare. We can prepare for what's coming and make our best possible future. Let's get ready.